this plug is the most famous plug in the whole world. I won 3 BASS tournaments on this plug, and I laid it on the table, and a film came on.
There is no doubt that East Tennessee is the cradle of the contemporary hand-carved crankbait. Out of necessity and maybe the desire to build a better mousetrap, carvers like George Boot Anderson and James Levingood got the cottage industry started in the early 1960s with their garage-made baits. Another of these early crankbait designers was Fred C.Young of Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Young had been tinkering with crankbait design since the mid-1960s. Prior to the end of the decade, he'd been in a work accident that put him in a full body cast with nothing to do. That's when he got serious about his carving and lure design. Bait after bait, he'd give to his brother Otis to try on the water. Finally, sometime around the end of the 1960s, the Big O was born. As local Oak Ridge and Knoxville area anglers found out about the bait, it got harder and harder for Fred to keep up with demand. He taught his mailman, John Morrow, and 2 other local Oak Ridgers, Mike Estep and Dave Carroll, how to make the baits to keep up with the demand. Then, in 1972, the Bassmaster Trail scheduled an event on Watts Bar in East Tennessee. Word traveled fast of the special crankbait being made in Oak Ridge, which led to a run on Big O's. Some of the pros were lucky enough to acquire the baits, others not so. Roland Martin was one of the unlucky pros. But, thanks to one of his guide trips on Santee Cooper, he'd heard of a similar bait from his client, Hal Clements. This bait was the Big E, made by Mike Estep. Hal gave Roland Estep's contact information, and Martin was able to acquire some baits for the East Tennessee Invitational. Martin won the event, and although he reported catching some of his fish on the Hellbender, it was Estep's Big E that caught the fish. Martin wasn't about to disclose the actual bait he'd discovered. Next, Roland would go on to fish the Bassmaster Rebel Invitational on Ross Barnett in Mississippi, where he would place 3rd on the Big E. Then he'd win again at the Oklahoma All-American on Lake Eufaula.
OBJ Woods here from Jasper, Texas, managing to get his lure off, one he purchased for $15 during the practice session. And he's mighty proud of that lure and is not about to lose it. Here comes a smallmouth, a beautiful smallmouth by Guy McCarty of Texas. Well, your big fish weighed 414.
What, $500?
What did you catch the bass on?
I caught both of them on a Big O. First time I ever threw one in my life.
What is this Big O?
Somebody makes it in Tennessee.
Y'all know what a Big O is?
No, but that's worth $500.
What does a Big O look like?
Real fat hot spot with a lip on it.
A fat hot spot with a lip on it.
And it's just like throwing a pork chop when you're trying to catch it.
It flies on you. It sails.
It does that.
By 1973, the handmade plug, whether it was the Big O, the Big E, or the many copycats, was catching on. The first Bassmaster event of the 1973 season, the Florida Invitational held on the St. Johns River, was won by Larry Hill on the Big O. Then Roland Martin would win the Rebel Invitational, the Seminole Lunker, and the All-American, all on the Big E. Also in early 1973, Fred Young had sold the rights to the Big O to Cotton Cordell. Cordell mass-produced the bait in plastic at volumes never obtainable by Young. Young continued carving a few lures with permission from Cordell. This left Mike Estep with more work than he could keep up with. The homemade lure had found its way into the lexicon of bass fishing. This is the story of Mike Estep, how he came to carving baits, and his contribution to the bass fishing industry. Mike Estep was born in Ashland, Kentucky, to Clarence and Virginia Estep in June of 1946. In January 1953, his father Clarence was killed in a car accident, leaving his mother to raise her two young boys on her own. Within the next 2 years, Virginia Estep moved the family to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and remarried to a man by the name of Calvin Holt. There they had 2 more children, a boy and a girl, and raised their family in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge, also known as the Secret City, was a sleepy little town known as the birthplace of the atomic bomb. Even in the 1960s, the town was still shrouded in secrecy due to its main source of employment. If you worked for the weapons plant, you didn't say much and tended to only speak to those that you worked with. Mike's stepfather and friend Young worked together at the K-25 plant. They were also neighbors who lived down the street from each other. The Clinch and Tennessee rivers provided a host of outdoor opportunities, and Mike became an avid bass angler. In the late 1960s, Estep and some of his friends formed the Atomic City Bass Club. The club would buy Big O's from Fred and use the lure to win most of the club-on-club competitions in and around Tennessee. That's when the popularity of the plug got to the point Fred couldn't supply the club anymore. Here are Estep's words how he got into bait making.
Well, Fred showed a select few people how to make the plugs and furnished us with materials and finishes to build our own. That's how I got started making the Big E. Came up with my own design by altering the size and the shape, and also weighted them differently. And as far as I know, I'm the first to put a rattle on a balsa plug.
By the start of the 1970s, Estep was in his mid-20s and was a design engineer at the Y-12 nuclear weapons plant. His day job required a keen eye for precision and accuracy, or the result could be a really bad day. Estep took this meticulous design theory into his bait making. While Fred Young continued carving Big O's after he sold the rights to Cotton Cordell, Mike Estep took what Young had taught him and started making subtle changes to the bait. The bill was changed from a rounded pattern to a coffin style, the paint was improved, and he also became the first to install rattle in the wood bait. By mid-1973, the Big O craze had all the major tackle companies copying the bait. Bill Norman introduced the Big N, Rogers had the Big Jim, Mann's the Fat Albert, Rebel the Super R, and Storm had the Fatso. Roland Martin, after his success with the Big E, tried to get Estep to manufacture his baits at a higher volume. In late 1972, he went to Winter Haven, Florida, and asked Jim Bagley if he could make the bodies. Bagley said he could.
Now, you know, as another interesting thing that happened with Mike and I, we tried to go in business for making these.
Right.
And I said, Mike, we can produce these things maybe in mass quantity.
Yeah.
And produce them somehow. You call them the Big O or Big E or whatever you want to call them, and I'll help promote them, and somehow or other we'll get together on the business. He said, well, how can we get that done? I said, I'll go to Jim Bagley. And Jim Bagley at the time didn't have the balsa beads.
No, all he had was a
didn't have-
Bangalore.
He had Bangalores and stuff, but he did have a balsa deal. So
Yeah.
this is balsa. So I went to Jim and I said, Jim, can you make this plug for me? Well, he had this CNC machine, you know, the copy things,
Copier, yep.
copy machine. And he looked at the plug and Jim said, yeah, I can make that. He says, I said, how much would it cost to make that? He said, oh, a couple bucks, whatever, we made some kind of deal.
Yeah.
I said, good, I'll talk to Mike. We might want to do this. We might go into business with Mike Estep and I. We'll mass produce these things.
Yeah.
Well, in the meantime, Mike was working for the Atomic Energy Commission in Knoxville, or
Here in Oak Ridge.
Oak Ridge.
Yep.
And his boss came to Mike and said, when he asked his boss about doing this little private enterprise,
Yeah.
his boss said, absolutely not. He said, you can't have a government contract and working in high security in the Atomic Energy Commission with any other job. You can't have any other job. It just can't, impossible.
Yep.
And so Mike called me and said, Roland, he says, they won't let me go into business making these plugs. I can't sell them on a commercial basis. I mean, I can make a few and give them away and like I'm doing, but I can't go into a big enterprise with it.
Yep.
And I said, oh. So Jim Bagley called. Again, he didn't have the Balsa B series.
Big B.
He didn't have any of that.
Yeah.
And he said, Roland, what do you want to do with the plug? And I said, Jim, heck, Mike can't do it, and I can't do it, so I don't know what to do. A month later, he came out with the Balsa B series.
Yep.
That's how it started.
Yeah. In April 1973, Jim Bagley introduced the Big B, which would later become the Balsa B series of Squarebills. As all the major companies brought their version of the Big O to market, Mike Estep continued making small batches of the Big E by hand while his client list continued to grow. One of those early clients was an avid North Carolina bass angler by the name of Tommy Isgett. Isgett first met Estep through word of mouth in the early 1970s. Soon they became close friends, fishing together on several occasions. This is how Tommy Isgett found Mike Estep and the Big E.
Me and a buddy of mine, we just got wind of it. We fished Santee so much and other lakes too, that we just got wind of this hot new lure, so we started making phone calls, didn't know where we were supposed to call or nothing, but we finally ran into Mike's name come up. And
next, Tommy recalls the year he first heard about the Big O, which led him to Mike Estep.
it was 70, when the Big O craze started, you couldn't get them, and like everybody was hunting a magic lure, which there's no such a thing, but everybody was hunting it. You gotta understand, bass fishing was just beginning. It was just beginning to boil out of the pot. I mean, and that's where we were at.
Contacting people back in the 1970s was a different game than today. With only landlines, state-to-state calls were long distance and cost a lot of money. Here Tommy talks about those early conversations with Estep and the price of the plugs.
Like I say, you had no phone other than landlines. We'd call out there and it cost $3 or $4, $5 for a phone call. You couldn't get rid of Mike. He wasn't his dime, he loved to talk. Just like we did. And we would order those things. They were less than $5 a piece when we first started ordering them. They were $4 something. And I have had the sheets on them, but I'm not sure the price off. And then eventually he went up to about $5, 50 cents for a rattler that made $5.50 a piece. And he stayed there for years and years and years at $5.
Because the baits were so good and hard to get, Isgett and his North Carolina fishing buddies kept the lure quiet. Here Tommy talks about why he had so much confidence in the Estep bait.
We would buy them. We didn't tell anyone where we got them, how we got them, what they were. Just an old crankbait, that's what we'd tell them, you know. And do I have enough faith in that lure at the right time of year when first fish are 5-6 foot of water, especially on stumps, that you can crank that thing down after a cold front comes through and fish tend to quit biting. I can bump a stump with that rattler in that thing and stop the lure and then start winding right back. And it will make them bite it in a lot of situations. Mike Estep plugs, a lot of times, if you're at a swimming pool or something, that's the best way to find out what's going on, is throw out a lure in a pool. And I want to crank it hard. I want to crank it with a high-speed reel, as fast as you can wind it. And if that plug is coming at you like this, and it darts that way, and it'll dart back the other way, that's the lure I want to fish. I want him darting around rather than just running a straight line. And Mike, I will say this, he stopped a few years ago, couldn't get the product, and then he started back. He used to make his own rattlers. He would take a piece of 22 brass, like you shoot in a 22 short rifle cartridge. He would take 2 of these, he'd put one in a vise and take a propane torch and heat it. And then he would take the other one, turn it upside down where you put them together like this. And he would put a BB shot inside the case, heat up the brass here on one empty cartridge and force it together, and that would make his rattler. If you hear them today, you can hear that lure coming through the water before you ever see it. That is the trick. That at that time, very few lures even had a rattler of any kind.
Yep.
And when that thing goes to knocking, they start knocking on your door.
Mike Estep baits were known for their quality. Tommy was one of the few who got to see Mike at work. Here he gets into some of the things Mike would do to ensure his baits were of the highest quality.
Mike Estep went to the lake, tied every crankbait that he made on a rod and reel, and he casted it. He wanted to see it coming through the water at speeds. If it would wiggle right at a fast speed, it's going to wiggle right at a slow speed. I'm going to call it an artwork for a better term. His paint jobs far surpass any that in my opinion. There's a lot of new stuff out there today, but people that's making these homemade lures today, they're just starting to get where Mike was 25, 30 years ago. I could tell y'all stories about Mike and his tools to make fishing lures, and you'll look at me and you'll say, there ain't no way. He would take, all right, he cut him a blank out, and blank just a piece of balsa wood, and he cut it, sand it to shape. The later years, he had a little homemade lathe, and he would cut it out from a pattern, and he made the little old lathe himself, and he would have patterns, different patterns for different shapes, and he'd put one in there, and he'd cut it out himself. And then he would take a plain old aluminum arrow, just like you shoot in a bow for deer hunting or whatever, target shooting. And he would take a file and file the edge of that arrow down, plumb sharp, the round part. And he would take and hold it like you would a pencil, and he would take that arrow and drill it into the balsa wood to a depth. The depth was determined by years of doing it. That's all I can tell you. If he put a rattler in it, he would drill that in there with the same arrow, and it will take a plug out when you pull the arrow out. Then a bill, he would take and just hold that thing upright in his hand. It had like a little old coping saw, and he would just saw that notch for the bill. By our eyesight, it was done free-handed. And believe me, I sat there at his table and I tried it. Well, man, what I made would run donuts. We didn't even have time enough. We wasn't no sense to even walk to the lake, which was his backyard, and try one, because they looked like an airplane blade. And it's not an easy task to do by eye. An imperial pocket knife. You used to walk in any country store and they had them hanging on the wall for $1 for a pocket knife. His pocket knife was literally, the blade on it was 3/4 gone, where it had been sharpened so many times. It was much more than a toothpick. And that's what he actually, you'd think, hey man, he's got a $20, $25 case carbon knife, to do his stuff with. Here he is with a $1 imperial pocket knife that was totally wore out, but it done the job.
Another collector and personal friend of Mike's was Joe Dameron. Dameron didn't meet Mike until 2001. Up to that point, he'd been a Fred Young collector, but after seeing Estep's baits, he changed his focus to Mike's baits. That meeting would be the start of Dameron becoming the world expert on Estep baits. Dameron has owned more Estep baits than any other collector and has cataloged every single style and color made. In the latter years, Estep himself would call Joe when he needed to remember the years a bait was produced or the quantity that was made. Here Joe recalls how they met and how he made Estep's collectible.
I met Mike in 2001 in Pigeon Forge. I was at a tackle show up there, and I was just walking around, had no idea who he was, never heard of him, didn't know anything about him. And he had some plugs laying there, and they were just the prettiest plug I ever seen. And that's what attracted him to me. And so I stopped, started talking to him. And at the time I was collecting Fred Young baits. And I'd never even heard his name before. He introduced himself and we talked a little bit. And I saw some of his baits, they were just the prettiest baits I ever seen. So I went ahead and bought, I think, a half a dozen of them. And took them over to my table, put them there, and didn't think a lot about them. And then the next year, when I went back, he was there again, him and Linda. And I bought some more baits off of him and got to thinking about it. And, some of these people, they had these massive collections of creek chub and heading and, just phenomenal displays. And all I wanted was something that somebody'd stop and look at and say, wow, that's pretty cool. And I thought, I'd never seen his baits before. I never saw a display of them. And so I decided to collect a few more of them and put a little display together. And I asked him about it. I said, would you mind if I put together a collection of these and did a little display at some of these shows? And he kind of gave me a dirty look. And he says, my baits are made to fish with. They're not made to look at. He said, they're made to catch fish. And I said, well, does that mean that you wouldn't want me to do a display of them? And he told me, he says, you buy them, they're yours. He says, you do what you want with them. He says, you could fish them, you could put them on the shelf, you could put them in a display. He says, excuse the language, but he says, you can stick them up your butt. He says, I don't care, they're your baits. And I thought, boy, this guy's a real jerk, And that was my first impression of him, kind of. And but somehow we became friends. I think the big thing is I bought more baits from him, and I put together just a little display, probably like that. And I took it back and I showed it to him. And when he actually saw it and saw how good it looked, that kind of turned him a little bit. And he actually started collecting baits after that. But prior to that, he did not want his baits put up in a case like this or on a shelf somewhere. He wanted them tied on the end of a rod and fished with. And that's what he made them for.
Mike was proud of his bait's fish catching ability, and it showed in his workmanship. Here Joe talks about improvements Mike made to the bait after being taught by Fred Young.
You could give Mike anything, and he was going to turn around and mess with it and basically perfect it. And that's what he did, in my opinion, with Fred's baits. Is he changed the lip, he changed the way they were weighted, changed the body shape, just pretty much redid the entire thing. As far as I know, no other bait was weighted in the same fashion that Mike weighted his baits. He went in at a horizontal angle and mounted the weight in the middle of the belly, whereas everybody else would come in the bottom of the belly and offset them at a 45-degree angle. And now I've never fished a Fred Young Big O. I collected them for many years, but I never fished them. But I fished Mike's baits, and they catch quality fish. I don't think I've ever caught a little bitty bass on a Mike Estep bait. And but in my opinion, he took it to a whole nother level. I think Fred kind of stumbled across the Big O. He didn't put a lot of, from what I gathered, didn't put a lot of research into it. He was just carving baits, and they happened to find a magic combination. But with Mike, I mean, if you look here in this case, one reason I call him an artist, the majority of these baits in here were painted with a can of spray paint. He didn't use an airbrush. Every one of these was painted with Krylon paint. That was another thing, he was very particular about what he did. He used Krylon paint only. He would not use any other brand because he said that he liked the way that it sprayed. And that's how he came up with the splatterback pattern, is you just barely push the top of the paint can down, get sputtered a little bit, and then you just go across the bait with it, and that gives you that splatterback pattern. But I think the way Mike was, he took everything to a different level. But with the crankbaits, I don't see how you could get a better bait than what he came up with. You couldn't get any higher level of quality than what he did. I mean, everything, like Tommy was saying, every bait he would throw, he told me 3 times. He'd throw it out 3 times. If it didn't run right, he'd adjust it. And if he couldn't get it adjusted, he'd turn it into a keychain. And of all the baits that I've owned, I've only owned a total of 6 of the keychains. And I've owned over 1,200 Estep baits. So that gives you a pretty good idea on the quality level. But as far as the finishes, the wood, the paint, I mean, just a can of spray paint to most people is a can of spray paint. But if it wasn't Krylon, he wouldn't touch it. And he actually, at one point, he called me and he said, I just painted the ugliest bait of my entire life. And he says, do you want it? I'm going to throw it away. And I said, yeah. I said, put it in a box and send it to me. And he told me he had went to Walmart and he bought a can of gold metallic spray paint. And he tried to do splatterback with that Walmart paint, and it didn't work. People complimented the bait and said it was one of the prettiest baits they'd seen. But he was so bad about that, he took a $2.99 can of paint back to Walmart and got his money back.
Next, Joe goes into the different generations of Estep baits, as well as some of the other baits he made besides the crankbait. In all, Mike made baits from 1970 through 2016.
As far as the handmade, that was a bit before my time, but from over the years, talking to him about it, studying them, trying to learn all I could about it, it was a very precise step-by-step process that he went through. And in the beginning, he would carve the body with a pocket knife. That little $1 pocket knife Tommy is talking about. But he would carve the body out, and then he'd go through a series of steps to make the bait itself, which I've got a display of over there that shows step by step. I think there's a total of 15 or 17 steps that you go through. But as far as the later baits, basically the only difference is instead of carving the plug with a pocket knife, he made a little duplicator. It's much like a key maker they have at the hardware store. He'd put a plug body in there, and then he'd move the thing back and forth, and he'd cut a little wood plug out, cut the body of it out, cut the ends off of it, and then every other step was identical to what he did with the handmade ones. But they're two completely different baits, in my opinion. The time period of 1970 until somewhere around 1985, he did what he called the homemade plug, which was carved by hand. And basically, like every plug in this display here, they're all the same plug. They're slightly different. The body style is a little different. The sizes are different. But they're a Big E plug. That's it, just one plug. And he figured all the innovations that he came up with. He was the first one to put a rattle in a plug. There were a number of other things that he did that were kind of ahead of his time. But up until around 85, basically he made one plug, just slight variations of it. He stopped making them due to personal reasons in his life, somewhere around 85. And he started back in 1991. That's when he made his little duplicator machine. And I consider that a completely different plug than the original hand carved. What they were from that point, they were particular baits. He changed styles. He had a Big E, which was standard, 3 different sizes. Then he made a Fred Young replica as an honor to Fred Young. He made a Big O. He made a top water, which he made in 2 sizes. He made a small one and a large one. The first batches he made 50 of each plug. Later, somewhere around 95, he started to make the small size again. He never did make the big top water after that. There was a total of 50 of those, and that's all that exists. But then he came up with, he made what he called a stubby plug, which was a little wake bait. He had a fellow, what was his name, Jerry Wells?
Jerry Wells.
He called
Flat Rock, Alabama.
Yep, he called Mike up, and he said he was fishing Lake Gunnersville, and he wanted a wake bait to fish in a tournament. So Mike sat down, he made 3 baits. He made 2 of the full-size stubbies and 1 as a baby stubby, and he sent those to Jerry, and Jerry fished that weekend in the tournament and ended up winning the tournament. But that's how the stubby was developed. And then Mike made a few chuggers. He made at least 3 Lucky 13s. But he made a few miscellaneous baits, but nothing in a lot of numbers. And then the last bait that he made is he simply took plug bodies, and instead of putting a lip on it, he put spinners on the ends of it. He made what we call a spin E, which is the E body, a spin O, which was the Big O, and then a top spin, which was the top water with spinners on it. And but each one of those baits was all basically the same because he used a duplicator. You know, all the Big O's were the same, all the top waters were the same. Whereas with the hand carved era, each individual plug is unique in itself. It's a creation by itself. And there's so much difference between the two. In my opinion, it's 2 completely different plugs that he made in 2 different eras. He also made a giant plug, which is slightly bigger than that one. And this was the very last plug he ever made, was this, what we call an extra large crankbait.
Can you pick it up and show it?
Yeah. That's this one here. And here again, to go back to the way that he was about things, the reason he didn't make the giants anymore is he says they use too much wood. he didn't want to spend that much money on a piece of balsa wood, so he made the baits considerably smaller. A giant is normally maybe that big and a little bigger in diameter.
Joe Dameron started collecting Estep's baits in 2001. Here he talks about their cost in 2001 and how they have become one of the most collectible baits at this time.
When I started collecting them in 2001, they were $105 for a half a dozen, $105 for 6. Worked out to about $17 a piece, which is still, for the amount of work and the quality of it. I mean, if you went to Walmart and bought a run-of-the-mill plastic crankbait, you're going to pay $3, $4, $5 for it. So to get a work of art and to put in all the effort that he went through to make those, at $17 was a reasonable price. At $17, at the time it was a little pricey to me, just to be buying them to stick in a case and look at, but I felt it was well worth it. And I bought what I could every time that I saw them. I would buy as many of them as I could. They've gone through the roof. They're highly collectible. Right now, I'd say they're the hottest bait in the collectible world, period. Before, and started winning awards, and that just that drove me even more as a motivation to put a better display together. And I think, like you said, I think it had a lot to do with putting Mike on the map.
In this next segment, Joe and Tommy recollect some of their memories with Mike. First off, we have a story about Mike and his hard-headedness. But as hard-headed as he was also a man of his word. Here, Joe talks about a bait that he begged Mike to paint for him for years, and he finally trapped him into doing it in a friendly way.
When I started buying Mike's baits up, it didn't take long to get the majority of the colors that he made, because he wasn't overly creative.
25.
So, 25.
Something, maybe less. Something.
But at one point, I gave him a list of production companies, Creek, Chubb, Hedden, Shakespeare. I gave him a whole list of colors that I wanted him to paint for me. And he did most of them. Some of the more advanced ones he didn't want to fool with. But at first he was a little hesitant on it, but he went ahead and did it for me. And I asked him the one time, I said, "Can you paint me a bait in frog?" And he looked at me, he said, "Frog is top water color." And I said, "Yeah, I know that, but they also dive." I said, "I want a crankbait in frog." And just plain as day, I ain't painting no damn crankbait in frog. And I worked on him 5 or 6 years. He'd say, "Hey, you want to put in an order?" "Yeah, I want a frog spot." I ain't making no damn frog spot. I don't know what it was about frog spot, but he'd paint me rainbow, strawberry, blueberry, whatever, you name it, he'd paint it for me. But he would not paint a frog for me. And towards the end, he started signing all his plugs and started numbering them, similar to what Fred did. And he called me up one day and he says, "Number 100 is going to be the first signed and numbered plug that has a rattle in it." He said, "Do you want to go ahead and reserve that?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to reserve that." And he says, "You tell me what color you want it when the time comes and I'll paint it." So I said, "Fine." I didn't even think about it at the time. Well, 6 or 8 weeks later, he calls up. He says, "Hey, I got number 100 ready to be painted." He said, "What color you want?" And I said, "I'd like that in frog spot." And he said, No. He said, "I told you I ain't painting no damn frog crankbait." And I said, "Well, no, what you told me is that I got to reserve that plug and I could have it painted in any color that I wanted." And he got quiet. He says, "Yeah." He says, "I guess you did." And he says, "So what color you want?" And I said, "Frog spot." And that's how, I don't have it here, But that's how I got my frog spot colored crankbait. And then he told me, he says, the number 150 is going to be the next one with a rattle in it. He said, do you want to reserve that one? And I said, yeah, go ahead and reserve that for me. Well, he called me a few weeks later, and he said, well, what color you want that? And I said, I want it in a red frog. I said, I want red with yellow dots on it. And he didn't even say nothing. He made a grr noise or something, just kind of, and that was the end of the conversation. But that red frog turned out to be one of the prettiest baits of my entire collection. It's just absolutely beautiful. But that's the way he was. He if he didn't want to do something, he wasn't going to do it, but he was a man of his word. If he told you he would, he was going to. That's how I got my frog bait.
When Mike relaunched his baits in 1991, he included a collector's edition pack with the 6 original colors from 1970. Here Joe talks about the collector's edition and the colors that were available.
Actually, the collector's sets came in 1991. Okay. When he started back making them, he decided to make the collector's set. And what it was the first 6 colors that he ever made his baits in. There was crawfish, there was a Roland Martin special, which is yellow and black. There was a Ernie Randolph, I believe it was one. Blue and white was one. Crawfish. What was the other one, Tommy? You got any idea?
I don't remember.
But it was the first 6 colors that he painted.
One was school bus.
He was going to make up to 150 or 250 sets of them, number 1 through 1500. But he ended up making roughly about 450 baits. There are a couple of them that are numbered higher, but that's kind of a fluke that I won't get into right at the moment. But basically there's probably 75 of these sets around.
Those are the O's and there's the...
Yep. Now these O's are not the same colors. So.
Right.
So, yeah, you have blue and white, Roland Martin, crawfish.
What do you call a Roland Martin?
The yellow and black. No, all the way over.
That.
That one's Roland Martin special.
No, they're all the same.
That one's an I believe Ernie Randolph. I think that's what that one is. And then silver shad.
Well, you take them 6 baits right there and go anywhere in the country and catch fish.
Yep, guaranteed. But if you look at those particular baits, the collector series, see what number's on the bottom of there. It'll be something / 1500. But see, these are, it's number 33. So these are like 33, 34, 35, up through that way. Yeah, they go up to 39. So 33 through 39.
Joe and Tommy have become close friends, all because of their love of Mike Estep baits. But when they first met, it wasn't so cordial.
At a tackle show, you have a one-of-a-kind bait, and you're going to have at least 3 people that come through the door and tell you, man, I got one of them at home. And so you learn, people just, they look at it and they think it's something they got. Well, I'm sitting there showing off my baits, and this big old fella comes in. Gentlemen, come on, we're on tape here, Tom.
That's what I mean, gentlemen.
Now this big old fella comes up and he looks, he says, man, I got a whole bunch of them. And I looked at him and I said, yeah, sure you do. Didn't think much about it. And he said, yeah, I got all 3 sizes, I got every color. I was like, yeah, okay. Didn't think a lot about it. And he sat there and looked around, didn't have much to say. He wanders off. There's somebody standing there beside me. I said, man, this guy's full of crap. And evidently I said it a little louder than what I thought, because he stops and turns around and he just glares at me. Doesn't say a word, just gives me this terrible, nasty look. Turns around, walks out the door. That's the last I seen of him. Well, the next year, I'm in there back at the same show, got my same display set up, and he comes walking in there, looks at me, and he says, you. get your butt outside. And I was looking at him, and I thought, damn, I'm about to take a real whooping here. And I was fully expected to go out in the parking lot and get beat up a little bit. And I walked out there, and he goes over to, I believe it was a Suburban he had, something like that. And he opens up the back door. He's got stacks of cases of Estep baits, every size, every color, everything just like he said he did. And I was just amazed because I'd never in my life seen so many Esteps. And from that point on, we become really good friends.
Didn't never fist.
Nope, never did do that fight.
Damn.
Yeah, me and Tommy we hit it off. I guess the Esteps is what brought us together and started our friendship, and it's been good.
Good friends is hard to come by.
Yep.
With a $1 knife, a couple of 22 shells, rattle can paint, and his hands in mind, Mike Estep was instrumental in the design of the Squarebill Crankbait we know today. He made some of the highest quality baits ever tied on a rod or placed in a display case. He strived for perfection and achieved it. What Mike probably didn't realize was all the people he brought together, friendships he unknowingly forged through his baits. Thank you, Mike Estep, for all you've done for the community. You and your baits will continue to bring joy to others for decades to come.